Kyung Hee Cyber University joined up with the Asia Institute to hold a seminar that brought together a diverse group of experts to discuss Korea's potential. The event took a unique approach that covered all aspects of Korea's culture and society. Culture meant not so much Korea's popular songs or its prowess in the automotive industry, but rather Korea's potential to act as a leader in ethical and environmental issues and to contribute to a peaceful global order. The approach in this event was indicative of the vision of Kyung Hee Cyber University, an institution committed to employing the internet as a means of bringing people together, thoughtful citizens from around the world, to build a better world. Consistently, Kyung Hee Cyber University has gone beyond simply offering courses online to bring together people who are interested in contemporary issues for important dialogues. The speakers at the seminar included Sang-hyun, Dean of Kyung Hee Cyber University and an expert on Japan, John Feffer, author and director of Foreign Policy in Focus, Emanuel Pastreich, director of the Asia Institute, and Kwon Byong-Hyon, chairman of Future Forest, an NGO dedicated to stopping the spread of deserts in China and former Korean ambassador to China. The event was held on November 22nd, 2013.
그럼 지금부터 본격적으로 이마누엘 페스트라이스 교수님이 한국인만 모르는 다른 대한민국이라는 저서에서 이미 말하고 있듯이 저도 한국이 세계를 선도하는 국가가 될 가능성이 있다고 생각합니다. 하지만 이 가능성이 현실이 되기 위해서는 해결해야 할 과제가 적지 않습니다. 일제강점기와 한국전쟁, 그리고 남북분단 체험에 의한 사고의 경직화에 대해 말씀드리겠습니다. 우리는 일제강점기에 살았던 사람들을 친일파, 그렇지 않으면 독립운동가 연나로 구분하여 생각하는 경향이 있습니다. 또한 한국전쟁과 남북분단이라는 경험을 통해 우리들은 그 당시에 살았거나 혹은 살고 있는 사람들을 우리 편인가 적인가, 친북인가 아닌가로 나누어 생각하는 경향을 지니게 되었습니다. 요컨대 우리와 남을 너무나도 명확히 구별하고 싶은 것입니다. 이것과 관련된 것이 제가 앞으로 말씀드릴 두 번째 이야기입니다. 한마디로 우리들은 외국인을 그대로 받아들이려고 하지 않는 경향이 있는 것 같습니다. 보통의 한국인은 외국인이 그들의 아이덴티티를 버리고 그냥 한국인이 되기를 바라고 있는 것은 아닌지요. 곧 그들이 우리에게 동화되기를 바라는 것입니다. 세 번째로 말씀드리고 싶은 것은 한국은 세계에 발신할 수 있는 보편적인 가치를 가지고 있는가입니다. 지하철을 타고 가다가 우연히 다음과 같은 표어를 발견하게 되었습니다. 부자 되세요 라는 것이었습니다. 그리고 이 표어는 꽤 오랜 기간 한국 사회를 휩쓸었고 지금은 한국인에게 체화되어 있다고 생각합니다. 하지만 이런 가치는 한국을 세계적인 문화 선진국으로 만들기에는 너무나도 부족한 것이라고 생각합니다. 여러분 어떻게 생각하시는지요?
16 years ago, I could not find Korea on the map. I had no idea. I didn't pay any attention to Korea at all. I was focused on Europe and the United States. I was Eurocentric. But then a friend of mine convinced me that Korea was important. I should study the language. I should study the culture. I should visit the country. And I did. And then suddenly, I couldn't stop talking about Korea and using Korean examples whenever I could to explain to my friends in Europe other paths of development. And I always would tell the story of the development of the Korean shipbuilding industry. How there really was no major shipbuilding industry here in Korea until the government decided it would build one. And almost from 0 to 100, in a very short time, Korea became a major shipbuilder in the world. And I would always use this example when talking to people in Europe and the United States to say, the idea of comparative advantage, that you have to use just what geography and weather and what is under the ground for your economic development, that you're a prisoner of what your comparative advantage is, that's wrong, that a country can break out of that. And Korea has proved to the world that this is true. And many countries look at Korea as an example in this regard. And I think that Korea has to make a decision over the next 5 to 10 years about what kind of role it will play in this specific pivot. Will it be a major military ally of the United States in the increased focus of the United States in this region from a military point of view? Or will Korea argue that there should be perhaps a different kind of pivot? So what do I mean by that? South Korea is in a kind of a difficult position, caught between its ally, the United States, and China, which is a major economic trading partner. So essentially, Korea has a choice. It can continue to be a major military ally of the United States, or it could argue for a different kind of security relationship in this region, a security relationship that is based more on common interests that would include China and not opposed to China. So I think the decision that South Korea makes, whether it can, together with the United States, establish a different kind of Pacific pivot, a pivot that is not just a military pivot, but a pivot which is actually a refocus on a different set of issues, not just a different part of the world. A pivot to focusing, for instance, on environmental issues, which affect all the countries in the region. A pivot to look at humanitarian issues, such as the aftermath of a hurricane or a nuclear disaster. A pivot to the interests that are common in the region. If South Korea and North Korea are able to close this gap of development and political structures, then I think the Korean Peninsula can show the way for the rest of the world. Because remember, the gap between North Korea and South Korea is actually very similar to the gap we see everywhere in the world. The gap between countries that are wealthy and countries that are not wealthy. The gap between countries that have democracies and the countries that don't have democracies. If you can come up with a formula for this very difficult task, then I think that formula can be applied all around the world and show the way to overcome what is still the most difficult gap in the world today between the haves and the have-nots, between the Democrats and the non-Democrats.
우리가 우리를 잘 아직까지 얼마나 우리가 아름다운가를 잘 모르고 우리 것이 얼마나 아름다운가 또 내가 얼마나 앞으로 가능성이 있는가를 아직까지 가늠하지 못하고 있는 게 아직도 잠꼬대하고 있는 게 취생몽사하고 있는 게 우리가 아닌가 싶습니다. 한국이 꼭 세계 제1 부자, 제일 강한 나라가 되는 것이 행복한 거 아닌 것 같아요. 아마 대한민국이 앞으로 통일이 되려면 대한민국을 뛰어넘어야만 대한민국을 잊어버려야만 통일이 될 거예요. 왜 그러냐 하면 한국 사람들 정말 좋은 사람들이야. 한국 사람 정말 좋은 이웃이야. 한국 사람 정말 좋은 지구를 위해서 좋은 일 하는 사람들이야. 지구의 전 가족하고 나눌 수 있는 따뜻한 마음을 가지고 정말 선량하고 또 잘 웃고 또 나눌 줄 알고 이런 사람이면 나눠져 있는 것보다는 좀 다시 붙여주는 게 좋지 않겠어 하는 지구인들의 마음, 우리 특히 이웃 나라들의 마음이 돌아설 때 우리가 통일이 될 가능성이 있지 않을까. 아니면 아마 우리 통일 안 될 거예요. 그런 의미에서 우리 한국 사람들은 한국을 뛰어넘어요. 그것 전에 물론 한국은 한국인에 대한 자아 발견을 먼저 해야 될 거예요. 내가 내 스스로를 발견하고 또 내 자신이 정말 한국이라는 게 아름답다는 것도 발견하고 그러면서 더 겸손하고 진솔하게 이웃과 더불어 사는 단 그 두 가지 조건이 있다고 봅니다. I think we have the two kinds of divides. 소위 양분화가 있는데 the first divide is, as you are well know, between the rich and non-rich. We have to share what we do have with less blessed people. Only then I think we will find the real happiness in our heart. And the second divide is between our mankind and nature, our mankind and the earth. I think that divide is wider than the divide between the humankind. So if we cannot heal those two kinds of divide, we can never find any real happiness at all. Yes, with that note, I conclude my remarks. Thank you. 소위 서양 문화의 하나의 그 오류 내지 아주 그 마지막까지 봉착한 거예요. 이 소위 어떻게 보면 동방 문화하고 서방 문화를 구분하기는 좀 어렵지만은 저는 논문에서 이렇게 썼습니다. 이 서방 문화는 자연을 정복하는 문화, 소비를 극한 때까지 조장하는 문화. 이것으로서 우리 지구는 이제 더 이상 서스테이너블 하지 않다는 거. 이미 100%를 넘어서 120%를 쓰고 있어서 우리 자손들은 더 쓸 게 없을 정도로 갔다는 것은 이건 서방 문화의 거의 종착점에 왔다고 하는 건데, 그런 의미에서 서방 문화에 대한 대칭으로서 우리 동양 문화라고 한다면 아까 내가 얘기한 천인합일 사상, 자연과 인간이 공생하고 같이 살 수 있는 문화로 돌아가지 않는다면 하나 인류의 공멸까지 갈 수 있다는 의미에서 우리가 다시 새로운 문명을 열지 않으면 안 된다. 그래서 저는 저도 이 새로운 문화가 지금 동트고 있지 않느냐, 동트지 않을 수가 없다 하는 얘기까지도 하고 있습니다.
The first I would say is that Korea is unique in there are many things unique about Korea, as there are about all countries, but it's the degree to which it has global reach, in which you have Korean companies, individuals, volunteers all over the world, and it's become a player in culture, in technology, in business, and many other aspects, governance, even global governance. And yet, that sort of global presence is not the result, really, of a legacy of imperialist expansion or colonial policy. Maybe Korea is the first country like that to reach that level of globalism without it being built upon that sort of a colonial expansionist mentality. My field was actually originally 17th century, 18th century literature, classical literature, Korean, Chinese, and Japanese. So I was always living when I was in Washington, as maybe John remembers, in this sort of like conflict between what I actually knew, what I was talking about, and then what I was actually trying to do on a daily basis. And I couldn't resolve these. It was a gap almost as large as the one between North and South Korea. I couldn't resolve them until about a year and a half ago, I started to stumble back onto the path. And I realized that, in fact, that classical tradition of Korea that I had learned about from the 17th and 18th century was where the future was. That, in fact, it was the most relevant thing for what Korea could do internationally, and the most relevant thing for addressing the crisis, many crises that we face. But I've become most interested, most fascinated in how we can make use of this tremendous know-how, tremendous knowledge in the past here in Korea, not just in Korea, by the way, but we're in Korea right now, and to adopt it and use it as an inspiration. In a sense, like, I'd say it's something like the Renaissance model, and I mean this in a very limited sense. In the 15th century, there were a bunch of people, 15th and 16th century, in Italy, and they started to do a lot of very, very exciting and very, very new things. They said, rhetorically, they said, we're going back to the great tradition of Greece and Rome. And you get buildings like the Sistine Chapel and Michelangelo's frescoes. But if you think about it carefully, I think you'll realize that the Sistine Chapel and what was done by Michelangelo and by other architects as well was totally unprecedented. It was definitely not going back to Rome or Greece. It was setting up totally new systems for architecture, for governance, for science, and for the humanities. And the act of going back in a philosophical, an intellectual, and a cultural sense was, in a way of going forward. And so I would say if Korea is going to be a leader globally, you have to be brave, of course, to step out into the totally unknown. And in fact, I don't think humans are capable of that. The only way to do it is to go back to the past and find what inspires you there and to recreate it as something truly new and original. Thank you. Say if you came to Seoul or Hanyang in 1830, it was cleaner than Paris or London, probably better administered, and I would even wonder about the level of education in Korea as opposed to countries like France or England. So a lot of those gaps are actually misperceptions about what traditional culture was like. Event at a different institute talking about North Korea and South Korea, and there's a lot of discussion about approaches and mention of Germany, for example. But when they talked about Europe and Germany, they left out, strangely, one critical part, which was the arms control system, right? I mean, in fact, the whole reunification and this whole process I don't think would have happened without this complex discussions about arms control for Europe. So I think this is something that really we have to keep in mind, is that this, if we think about Asia today, it's clear that we are looking at the center for technology, for economic growth, for cultural generation, but we can't help but be aware of what happened exactly 100 years ago in the case of Europe. Thank you.